Right now, in the waters between Iran and Oman, an American helicopter is hunting cargo ships. Not warships, not military vessels. Ordinary cargo ships carrying ordinary cargo, crewed by ordinary civilian sailors just trying to get home. And in the last 3 weeks, 3 of them have been hit. The most recent one happened only hours ago. A U.S. Navy MH-60 helicopter fired 2 Hellfire missiles directly into the engine room of a container ship called the Vela Nova, a Panama-flagged vessel almost 500 feet long, after its crew, according to the United States military, ignored repeated warnings to turn back. The missiles tore into the steering gear and the engine room. The ship did not sink. It did not need to. It was left dead in the water, unable to move, a 500-foot warning sign floating in one of the most dangerous stretches of ocean on Earth. This is not a war story from 6 months ago that you missed. This happened yesterday. This is happening right now, while most of the world is still watching the wrong headlines. And if you think this is just another blockade enforcement story, one more line in a long list of ships turned away, you are about to see why that assumption might be the most dangerous mistake you can make about what is unfolding in the Strait of Hormuz at this exact moment. Before we go further, I want you to understand something. What you're about to hear is not speculation dressed up as fact. Every figure, every date, every quote in the next half hour is drawn from confirmed statements by the United States Central Command, from Reuters, from CNN, from Al Jazeera, from the BBC, and from Iran's own state media. Where something is uncertain, I will tell you it is uncertain. Where something is confirmed, I will tell you exactly who confirmed it. Because in a story this dangerous, the difference between what we know and what we are guessing at is not a small detail. It might be the only thing standing between understanding this war and being manipulated by it. If stories like this, the ones that actually explain what is happening instead of just reacting to it, are why you come to this channel, do one thing for me right now. Tap that like button. Subscribe if you have not already. It costs you nothing. And it is the only signal that tells this channel to keep chasing the parts of this war that vanish from the headlines after 24 hours. Now let's get into exactly what is happening in the Strait of Hormuz, why it has reached this point, and why what the United States Navy has been doing there over the last several weeks may be more significant than almost anything else happening in this war right now. To understand why a helicopter is firing missiles into cargo ships in the year 2026, you have to go back to the morning this entire war began. On February the 28th, President Trump announced what the White House called major combat operations against Iran. In a coordinated strike with Israel, American and Israeli forces hit military, government, and infrastructure targets across the country in a single devastating wave. Among the casualties in those opening hours was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, killed in a strike that instantly reshaped the balance of power inside the Islamic Republic. This was not a symbolic strike. This was a decapitation of the single most powerful office in the entire country, carried out in the opening hours of a war that had barely begun. Iran did not simply absorb that blow. Within hours, Tehran launched a sweeping retaliatory campaign, missiles and drones aimed at American bases across the region, at Israel, and at Gulf states hosting American forces. And then Iran reached for the one lever of power that could hurt the entire global economy at once. It moved to close the Strait of Hormuz. Here is why that single decision mattered more than almost anything else Iran could have done. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel, barely 21 miles wide at its tightest point, sitting between Iran and Oman. Before this war, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and a fifth of the world's liquefied natural gas passed through that channel every single day. There is no easy detour around it. A ship that cannot pass through Hormuz has to sail thousands of extra miles around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks to a voyage and sending insurance costs into territory that can bankrupt a shipping company overnight. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps did not simply announce a closure and hope the world listened. It issued warnings over marine radio forbidding passage. It began boarding and attacking merchant vessels. It laid sea mines across the waterway, with some estimates suggesting Iran holds somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 naval mines, along with the vast majority of the small boats needed to deploy them. And in a detail that should genuinely unsettle you, multiple reports at the time suggested Iran itself lost track of exactly where all of those mines had actually been placed. Think about what that means. A country deliberately scattered thousands of unmarked explosive devices across one of the most heavily trafficked waterways on the planet, and even its own military could not say with certainty where all of them were. Within days, the corridor was functionally closed to most commercial shipping. Hundreds of tankers became stranded on both sides of the strait. Oil prices spiked violently. War risk insurance premiums for a single tanker crossing jumped from roughly $200,000 to well over $1 million within hours, according to reporting from maritime intelligence sources tracking the crisis in real time. This is the moment worth pausing on, because it tells you something that will matter for everything that follows. For nearly 50 years, the world has treated the Strait of Hormuz as one of the great unspoken rules of the global economy. No matter what tensions exist between Iran and the West, the oil keeps moving. Even during the height of the Iran-Iraq War in the 1980s, when the United States ran an entire military operation called Operation Earnest Will, specifically to escort tankers through these same waters, the strait never stayed fully closed for long. What Iran did in February of this year broke that unspoken rule completely, and the entire architecture of this current conflict has been built on top of that single fracture ever since. So how did the United States respond to a closed strait, a stranded global oil supply, and a country that had just lost its supreme leader and was lashing out in every direction it could reach? Slowly, and then very suddenly. In March, an aerial campaign specifically targeting Iranian naval vessels and drones began, aimed at reopening the strait by force. In April, the United States imposed a full naval blockade on Iranian ports, an operation that would eventually be described by American officials as costing Iran roughly $500 million a day. In May, Washington launched something called Project Freedom, an operation designed to create a protective zone for commercial ships willing to attempt the crossing. That operation barely lasted a week. Iranian forces responded by sending missiles to drones and small boats directly at 3 American Navy destroyers, the USS Mason, the USS Rafael Peralta, and the USS Truxtun, as they moved through the strait. The United States destroyed 6 Iranian small boats along with cruise missiles and drones in the exchange that followed. Project Freedom was quietly paused days later. Here is where the story most people know starts to end, and where the story almost nobody is covering properly actually begins. A ceasefire negotiated in June briefly convinced the world this might finally be over. Delegations from both countries entered negotiations aimed at a war-ending deal based on a signed memorandum of understanding. For a moment, tankers began moving again. South Korea mobilized its trade and foreign ministries specifically to help 7 of its own oil tankers, carrying a combined 14 million barrels of crude, safely cross the strait while that narrow window stayed open. It felt, for a few short weeks, like the worst of this crisis might actually be behind us. It was not. By mid-July, that ceasefire had effectively collapsed. The United States resumed both the naval blockade and a renewed campaign of strikes. And it is inside this exact window, the moment the diplomatic track failed and the military track resumed at full force, that the United States Navy did something it had never done before in its entire history. Microhook right here, because this is the part of the story that should genuinely stop you. On the night of July the 12th, 3 small unmanned boats, carrying nobody, left an American position near the Persian Gulf. They moved fast, low, and quiet through the dark water toward Bandar Abbas, Iran's most important naval base, the single facility overlooking the entire Strait of Hormuz. Minutes later, according to U.S. Central Command's own confirmed statement, that base was on fire. These were called Corsair unmanned surface vessels, 24-foot autonomous boats built by a company called Saronic, capable of carrying 1,000 pounds of payload over more than 1,000 nautical miles. CENTCOM confirmed that 3 of these Corsair drones struck a submarine and ship maintenance facility inside Bandar Abbas Naval Base, marking, in the command's own words, the first time American forces had ever employed sea drones in combat operations. Video released by CENTCOM shows an aerial view of 3 small vessels speeding toward a raised dock holding what appears to be a small submarine, then exploding one after another, sending thick plumes of smoke into the night sky. Nobody died flying those boats in because nobody was in them. And that single fact changes far more about this war than a single night of damage to a single dock. If you are starting to see how much bigger this story is than a routine blockade update, stay with me, because we are only a few minutes into a story that gets more serious the deeper you go. Here's something worth understanding about these drones, because it did not come out of nowhere. This exact same Corsair platform had already made headlines in this war once before, for an entirely different reason. Just 1 month earlier, in June, a Navy-operated Corsair helped rescue 2 American soldiers after their Army Apache helicopter went down near the Strait of Hormuz. That drone was unarmed for that mission. It was there to see, to sense, to extend America's reach over dangerous water without risking more sailors. A CENTCOM spokesman confirmed at the time that the task force had begun quietly fielding these drones in the region as far back as late March. In other words, this was not a rushed, desperate improvisation. This was a capability the United States military had been building and testing in the shadows for months, waiting for exactly the right moment to shift from watching to striking. Why does that matter so much? Because for nearly 50 years, Iran's entire naval strategy in these waters has depended on one core assumption. Fast, aggressive small boats swarming an American vessel only work as a deterrent if the other side has something real to lose in the exchange. American lives, American sailors, American political will to keep fighting after casualties start coming home. A drone that carries nobody removes that leverage completely. It costs a fraction of a crude warship. Losing one costs nothing but money. It can be built and replaced faster than a destroyer, faster than a submarine, faster than anything Iran has in its own arsenal. Iran's entire small boat playbook, refined over decades specifically to intimidate American crews, simply does not work the same way against a machine that has no crew to intimidate. This is not just an Iran story either, and understanding why makes this moment feel even more significant. This exact kind of warfare, cheap unmanned boats used to strike far more expensive targets, exploded into the modern military conversation through a completely different war, thousands of miles away in the Black Sea. Ukraine's use of naval drones against Russia's much larger Black Sea fleet became one of the defining stories of that conflict. A smaller navy using inexpensive uncrewed vessels to damage and sink ships worth hundreds of millions of dollars, eventually forcing Russia's fleet to retreat from waters it had controlled for years. Military analysts have pointed directly to that experience as shaping how the American military now approaches contested, mine-filled, missile-heavy waters exactly like the Strait of Hormuz. What happened at Bandar Abbas was not an isolated experiment. It was a lesson learned in one war, deliberately applied against Iran for the first time in American combat history. If this is painting a picture that feels bigger and more urgent than what you have seen anywhere else, that is exactly why this channel exists. Take 15 seconds right now, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications, because what comes next in this story is moving so fast that most coverage cannot keep up with it. Let's talk about the number that should genuinely worry anyone tracking how sustainable this war actually is for the United States military. According to CNN reporting from early August, sources say nearly 80% of interceptors for a key American missile defense system have already been depleted during this war. Read that number again. 80%. That is not a detail about Iran running low on options. That is a detail about the United States managing its own limited stockpiles in a conflict that has now run for more than 5 months across multiple simultaneous fronts. Iran, the Red Sea, and beyond. This is exactly why a cheap, expendable drone boat matters strategically, far beyond a single strike on a single dock. It is not just a tactical innovation. For a military watching its own high-end munitions run dangerously thin, it may be closer to a necessity. Now let's move forward into what has happened since Bandar Abbas, because the pace of events over just the last few weeks has been staggering, and this is where the story becomes genuinely urgent rather than historical. Just days after the Corsair strike, American forces disabled 2 Iranian-flagged oil tankers, the MT Star 3 and the MT Sevda, after they attempted to cross the U.S. blockade. A Navy FA-18 Super Hornet fired precision munitions directly at the smokestacks of both vessels. A deliberate, controlled use of force rather than an indiscriminate strike, disabling them without sinking them. CENTCOM's commander, Admiral Brad Cooper, stated plainly that American forces remained committed to full enforcement of the blockade. That was only the beginning of a pattern that has continued, almost without pause, ever since. On July the 17th, American forces disabled the Curacao-flagged MT Belma after it ignored warnings to stop. 1 week later, on July the 24th, they disabled the Mozambique-flagged MT Levine in the same manner. And then, just yesterday, on August the 11th, an American MH-60 helicopter fired 2 Hellfire missiles into the engine room of the Panama-flagged Vela Nova, a container ship nearly 500 feet long, marking the 3rd vessel disabled since the blockade was reimposed in mid-July. CENTCOM confirmed that, as of that date, it had redirected 55 commercial vessels attempting to run the blockade, disabled 3 non-compliant vessels, and boarded 2 more. In the command's own words, American forces remain, quote, highly vigilant, focused, lethal, and ready. Sit with that phrase for a moment. Lethal and ready. Directed not at warships, not at military convoys, but at civilian cargo crews trying to move ordinary freight across ordinary water. This is the daily reality inside the Strait of Hormuz right now, and it is escalating in real time as you watch this video. Here is a detail that deserves far more attention than it has gotten. Just 1 day before the Vela Nova was hit, on August the 10th, President Trump stated publicly that the United States had swept the Strait of Hormuz for mines and now had, in his words, full control of the vital waterway. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps has not confirmed that claim, and independent verification of a full minesweeping operation across such a wide and historically mined area has not been separately confirmed by outside naval analysts. What we can say with confidence is this: the President of the United States is now publicly claiming total naval dominance over the strait. At the exact same moment, his own military is still firing missiles at civilian cargo ships attempting to cross it. Those 2 facts, sitting side by side, should tell you something important about how far apart the public narrative and the situation on the water actually are. And while all of this has been happening on the water, something almost nobody is talking about has been unfolding inside Iran's own leadership, and it is genuinely unsettling once you understand it. Following the killing of Ali Khamenei in the war's opening hours, Iran's supreme leadership passed to his son, Mojtaba Khamenei. Here is the detail that should raise real questions in your mind. As of the most recent reporting available, Mojtaba Khamenei has not appeared publicly since becoming the country's top political and religious authority. Iranian state media has only released a single undated video of him. Just this week, on August the 10th, Khamenei reshaped the country's entire military leadership in a single announcement, naming 6 senior appointments at once, including a new Armed Forces Chief of Staff, a new Commander-in-Chief of the Revolutionary Guard, and a new Commander of the Revolutionary Guard's Navy, the exact force responsible for everything happening in the Strait right now. Think about what that actually means for a moment. A country locked in an active war with the United States, fighting over control of one of the most important waterways on the planet, has a supreme leader who has not been seen in public since taking power, communicating only through undated video, while simultaneously reshuffling every senior military command position connected to that exact conflict. That is not the profile of a government confidently managing a crisis from a position of strength. That is the profile of a leadership structure under enormous internal pressure, making major decisions from the shadows, while the war it is fighting escalates in full public view. If you are feeling the weight of how much is genuinely at stake here, that is exactly the point. Drop one word in the comments right now describing how this story makes you feel, because I read every single one and it tells me exactly which threads to keep pulling on next. Let's talk about the diplomatic track, because this is where the story becomes almost impossible to predict with any confidence, and where both sides appear to be sending completely contradictory signals within the same 48-hour window. By early August, multiple outlets reported that the United States, Iran, and Oman appeared to be edging closer to an interim agreement to reopen the strait. Iranian officials said they had agreed on coordinates for new shipping routes, with Oman acting as intermediary. A spokesperson for Qatar's foreign ministry confirmed drafts of a potential agreement were, in their words, being circulated and in progressive stages. American officials, including the Treasury Secretary and Secretary of State, publicly expressed optimism in the first days of August that a deal could come within days. And then, within a single week, that optimism collapsed into open contradiction. Iran's Secretary of the Supreme National Security Council, Major General Mohsen Rezai, stated flatly on Iranian state media that the strait, quote, will not be opened until the United States changes its behavior and accepts Iran's conditions. Those conditions, according to Rezai, include an end to the war, a full American troop withdrawal from the region, financial compensation for war damage, and resolution of conflicts in Gaza and Lebanon as well. Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araghchi, separately stated there was, in his words, no possibility of restarting negotiations, as long as the United States continues violating the June Memorandum of Understanding. President Trump's response was equally uncompromising. He told reporters the United States is only, quote, semi-negotiating with Iran, and demanded that Tehran compensate victims' families in Middle Eastern countries before any further talks proceed. He said he had instructed his representatives to place that demand firmly into any and all future negotiations. On the same day, the Treasury Department imposed its 8th round of sanctions on Iran so far this year, specifically targeting what officials describe as Iran's shadow banking system, the financial networks Iran has been using to move money around the restrictions already in place. A Treasury statement said plainly that Iran's shadow banking system is, quote, buckling under economic fury, the name given to this financial pressure campaign, and that the regime is running out of ways to move money. So here's the honest, uncomfortable truth sitting underneath all of this. As of right now, this week, both sides are publicly describing a deal as close, while simultaneously issuing conditions the other side has already rejected. That is not the sound of a negotiation reaching its final stages. That is the sound of 2 exhausted governments performing diplomacy for their own domestic audiences, while neither one is actually prepared to make the concession the other one needs. And this conflict is not staying contained to Iran and the Strait of Hormuz either. It is spreading. Iranian-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen renewed attacks on the government-held port city of Mocha, striking it twice within 24 hours, according to reporting from this week. Separately, Houthi forces struck a cargo ship in the Red Sea, killing 6 people and injuring 10 more, according to Yemen's internationally recognized government. Pakistan's own defense minister was publicly addressing questions about the widening conflict in the same news cycle. What started as a war over Iran's nuclear and military infrastructure, then narrowed into a fight over a single narrow strait, is now visibly expanding into a second major shipping corridor, threatening to turn one regional crisis into 2 simultaneous global trade emergencies at the exact same time. Let's step back now and talk about what all of this actually means from a military perspective, because both an exaggerated version of this story and an understated version of it would be dishonest, and you deserve the real picture. What has genuinely changed? Iran's entire strategy in this strait has always depended on asymmetric harassment, fast boats, mines, drones, and missiles used to make the crossing costly and dangerous enough that commercial shipping avoids it, and American forces hesitate to fully commit. A drone strike on the exact facility that maintains and repairs the vessels Iran depends on for that harassment campaign is a direct hit against the infrastructure, underneath the strategy itself, not just the boats. And because uncrewed vessels remove the single biggest deterrent Iran has traditionally relied on, the political cost of American casualties, this expands the range of operations Washington can authorize without paying that same price at home. What has not changed, at least not yet. A single strike on a single facility does not by itself dismantle Iran's overall naval capability. Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps has continued asserting control over the strait well after losing that maintenance facility, and Iranian officials continue publicly insisting the waterway remains closed on their terms, not America's. Every ship disabled by American forces so far has been a civilian cargo vessel, not a military target, which tells you Iran itself has largely avoided sending its own naval assets directly into these specific confrontations. Recently, a sign of caution, not collapse. And the broader war of attrition, missiles, sanctions, blockade enforcement, and diplomatic maneuvering happening in parallel remains the dominant shape of this conflict. One new weapon platform is a significant development inside that war. It is not, on its own, the ending of it. The honest framing sits directly between the two extremes you will find elsewhere online. This is a genuine, historic shift in tools and tactics, the first combat use of American sea drones ever recorded, happening inside a live, ongoing war. It is not, by itself, a knockout blow against Iran's control of the strait. And anyone telling you with total certainty that it is has stopped reporting and started guessing. So where does this actually go from here? Based on everything confirmed up to this point, there are a small number of realistic directions. This specific story, the naval drone campaign sitting inside this much larger war, could take in the days and weeks ahead. None of these are guarantees. They are informed possibilities built directly from the pattern of the last several months. The first scenario is continued and expanding use of unmanned strike platforms. If the Corsair strike on Bandar Abbas is judged a tactical success inside the Pentagon, and CENTCOM's own public statements strongly suggest it was framed as exactly that, it becomes highly plausible that these boats stop being a rare, notable first and start becoming a routine part of how the Navy applies pressure in these waters. Given the reported strain on traditional missile interceptor stockpiles, there's a real and growing logistical incentive to lean further into cheaper, expendable unmanned systems, rather than continuing to draw down munitions the country cannot easily replace. The second scenario is that a genuine Hormuz agreement, brokered through Oman, eventually takes hold despite the current impasse. And this entire chapter of naval escalation becomes remembered as the final violent phase before an actual resolution. The optimistic statements from American, Qatari, and Iranian officials earlier this month make this a real possibility, even though the same week produced Iran's hardest public conditions yet, and a fresh round of American sanctions. It is worth remembering, soberly, that an earlier ceasefire in this exact war collapsed once already, back in July, after early hopes that it would hold permanently. The third scenario, and the one that deserves the most caution of all, is that the diplomatic track and the military escalation simply continue running side by side indefinitely, without either one fully resolving the conflict. A pattern this specific war has already proven it is fully capable of sustaining for months at a time. Iran's continued insistence on troop withdrawal and financial compensation, combined with a supreme leader who has not appeared publicly since taking power, and a military leadership reshuffled this very week, all suggest a government that is not currently positioned to make the kind of clean, fast concession a quick deal would require, no matter how many optimistic headlines circulate about talks being close. Which of these three plays out will very likely become clear within weeks, not months, given how fast this specific standoff has been moving just in the last several days alone. Here's what we can say with real, verified confidence, based entirely on what has been publicly confirmed by the United States military, Iranian state media, and independent outlets covering this war in real time. On July the 12th, 2026, the United States military used unmanned surface vessels in combat for the first time in its entire history, striking a submarine and ship maintenance facility inside Iran's most important naval base on the Strait of Hormuz. In the weeks since, American forces have disabled at least 5 vessels attempting to cross the naval blockade, most recently firing Hellfire missiles into a civilian cargo ship less than 24 hours before this video was made. Iran's new, largely unseen supreme leader has just reshuffled his entire military command structure. Diplomatic talks that seemed close to a breakthrough one week collapsed into hardened, incompatible demands the very next. And a second major shipping corridor, the Red Sea, is now showing fresh signs of being pulled into the exact same widening conflict. What we cannot say with confidence is exactly how much long-term damage that first drone strike caused inside Bandar Abbas, whether Iran's naval capability in the strait has been meaningfully degraded as a result, or whether the current diplomatic track will actually hold where the last one did not. Anyone claiming certainty on any of those three questions right now is not reporting. They are guessing, and dressing that guess up as insight. What is clear, and what should stay with you long after this video ends, is this. For nearly 50 years, Iran built its entire approach to this waterway around one core assumption: that American caution, rooted in the value of American lives, would always create room for Iran to maneuver, threaten, and control the terms of engagement. Over the last several weeks, that assumption has been tested more directly than at almost any point in that entire history, first by a handful of unmanned boats with nobody inside them, and now by a blockade willing to fire real missiles at real civilian ships in broad daylight. Whether that shift becomes the moment this war finally turns toward resolution, or simply one more entry in a conflict already defined by escalation and negotiation happening at the exact same time, is something only the next few weeks are actually going to tell us. If this video gave you the real picture instead of just another headline about missiles and negotiations, do 3 things before you go. Subscribe if you have not already, so you do not miss what happens next in this exact story. Hit like, because it is the single biggest signal that tells this channel these deep, verified breakdowns are worth making. And share this with one person who is only seeing the surface level coverage of this war because they are missing exactly the parts of it that actually matter. I will see you in the next one, the moment there is something real to report.